When Matt Taibbi set out to cover the 2004 presidential race, he had no idea just how mind-numbing the whole exercise would become. His dispatches from the trail were collected in his book, Spanking the Donkey, which drew critical praise and suggestions that he was the next Hunter Thompson. His latest book, Smells Like Dead Elephants, Dispatches from a Rotting Empire, just came out, and he's back on the trail, this time for Rolling Stone, following the 2008 Republican candidates and the media entourage that surrounds them. Matt Taibbi, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and let's talk a little bit about Russia and also about the newspaper you founded there with Mark Ames called The Exile.
Okay. What would you like me to talk about?
Well, I guess I'm interested to see how much of your style and approach that you've sort of been using here on the campaign trails, how much of that is derived from your experiences in Russia, and especially with The Exile, because you were definitely doing a lot of crazy things in order to get the news there. So
yeah, I think the style that I use now is significantly different from what I would have done in Russia. I mean, our general philosophy with The Exile was just to try to be a fly in the ointment. I think, for instance, if I was going to cover a campaign event for The Exile, what I would probably do is, like release a bag of rats or something like that in the middle of a Mitt Romney speech, or show up in a lobster costume or something like that. I mean, I did a little bit of that, I guess, in '04, but nowadays mostly what I do is, I'm much more of a straight mainstream type reporter now than I would have been at The Exile. We were much more trying to be provocateurs back then, and I think my job now is much more to be a so-called responsible journalist at this point. So,
I mean, sort of tagging on to that with the idea of being provocateurs, you guys could pretty much get away with that too, right? I mean,
yeah. I mean, the unique thing about The Exile was that we were in a situation where we were unaccountable both to the law and really to advertisers, because obviously we were an English language paper that was writing mostly about Americans, that was out of the reach of American libel law, and we were also, and the Russian government wasn't really paying attention to us either, so we didn't really have any legal issues, and the few that we did have tended to be resolved extra legally anyway, because Russia's rule of law is not exactly consistent. I think it's much more of a gangster state than an actual state. So the few disputes we did have were resolved by means of organized crime sit-downs and that sort of thing. And at the same time, our advertisers were mostly Russian business owners who owned, say, nightclubs in Moscow and that sort of thing, who the only thing that mattered to them was that our readers were reading the newspaper and were responding to the advertisements. They didn't really care what the content of the newspaper was, so we could really do whatever we wanted, and most of the time the people who were paying us the money weren't even reading the paper, so we could do all kinds of things and not have to worry about the ramifications of it. Obviously we had a few things, a few situations where that backfired on us. I mean, there was one time where we decided to put out an issue entirely in French, just for fun, and
right.
They noticed that, but that's about what it took, So.
Gotcha. And I'm curious now to fast forward a little bit to 2004, when you covered a number of campaigns and led you to I guess a state of extreme depression, but it also gave you a book. And let's talk a little bit about Howard Dean's campaign and
sure.
Sort of your take on that. Was it doomed from the beginning, or did it sort of collapse as things went along?
Well, what you have to understand about Howard Dean is that his whole candidacy really highlighted a schism within the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democratic Party in the mid-'80s made a decision, and it was, this is after the creation of the Democratic Leadership Council, that they didn't want to be beholden anymore to the traditional funding sources like the unions and the special interest groups, and they wanted to open up that funding their funding sources to big business, and so they decided to recraft their platform to be more attractive to corporate campaign contributors. And so you had that wing of the party, the DLC sort of supported candidates, which were like Bill Clinton and Joe Lieberman and Al Gore and now Hillary Clinton and those people. And so they came up with a platform that was, say, more socially liberal but economically conservative, or economically pro-business, I guess is the best way is the way they would probably put it. And because of that, the Democratic Party started to drift in a more reactionary direction in terms of its domestic policies, and it did stuff like NAFTA, which was antithetical to what the old Democratic Party would have done when it was dominated by unions. And what Howard Dean did when he came along is that he decided that he was going to eschew those kinds of funding sources, and he was going to try to raise money and support in a new way, which was mostly through the internet and appealing to individuals. And so he did that. He was very successful. He was an anti-war candidate who created a lot of buzz, outside the traditional media, and that was a challenge to the party hierarchy. And that was a big deal when Howard Dean came around and he posed this challenge to the party, and that's why you saw people like John Kerry and Dick Hepburn joining forces to issue commercials, sort of tying Howard Dean to Osama bin Laden in Iowa and stuff like that. I mean, the party was very, very nervous about Howard Dean becoming the nominee, and he could have succeeded, but I think in the end the sort of mainstream power structure, I hate to use that term, but I think they closed ranks around him and they made sure that he wasn't the candidate. I mean, when I was on the campaign trail following him, Dean had to answer 50 or 60 questions a day from newspaper reporters about how, aren't you too liberal to be the president? Aren't you too prickly to be the president? Aren't you too this to be the president? And then when John Kerry became the candidate, it was all, they were much softer on him. So, he was swimming uphill, or swimming upstream, I'm sorry, the whole time.
Right. But another thing, I gathered from reading your book was that you sort of had the impression that the buzz didn't quite match the reality, in the sense that, his the image that was sort of created around Dean didn't really correspond to, a realistic look at his platform, and that I guess the more alternative candidate, if you will, was like Dennis Kucinich or.
Oh, sure.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, there was nothing politically radical about Howard Dean, about his platform. I mean, I think he was really just a traditional Democrat in terms of what the policies that he was espousing. And this is a guy who grew up in the Hamptons, and he was basically an economic conservative, and there wasn't anything that was scary about him personally. But what was different about him was how he wanted to raise money and how he wanted to secure his power base. And that was different. That was new, and that was radical, and that was a threat to the party. So the fact that they freaked out about Howard Dean, and turned him into this, liberal Gorgon in the media was kind of amusing, given that he really wasn't that. But the threat to them, was of a different sort that Howard Dean posed.